Shalom Aleichem. Happy Wednesday night to you. I am right now going through the Parshas, and I want to do a study that other people have asked me to talk about, which I find exciting. This will be my fourth time teaching this segment, and I will tell you that this time is far different than the last time, which is far different than the time before, which is far different than the time before. The older I get, the more resources I get, the more difference I come to understand Daniel. And Daniel is not the easiest one to understand because there is so much that he says and doesn't say that's going to be a part of our story. As we go through this, I want to begin by talking about, there's a writing called the Midrash Shoker Tov. And in chapter 31, in verse 7, it says there were only two people to which God revealed the end of days. The first one was Jacob. And Jacob in chapter 49 wanted to give his understanding to his sons, but instead the Spirit left him, and all he could do was to bless his sons. The other character is right here in Daniel. He is the other character who knows it all. In fact, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 9, the angel tells him, go rest now. Doesn't allow him to express all the other information that he knows. So we're going to begin with those two kinds of understandings. I want you to also understand in the typical understanding of a prophet. Now, a prophet is considered something quite different than what we have usually thought of. It comes from the book of Numbers, and it comes from chapter 12, when God was chastising Miriam and Aaron, talking about God speaks to people in three ways. With Moses, he spoke face to face. Otherwise, he spoke to people in dreams and in visions. Now, Daniel is going to have both dreams and visions, but understand the all-encompassingness of his dreams are going to be such that they do not fit into a neat category. In fact, in the Bible, in Megillah chapter 3a, we are told specifically that Daniel was not a prophet. So he is what they would call a hacham. He is a wise man. He is a scholar. So his understandings and what he puts into his 12 chapters that we have here are going to be based upon his intellect, going to be quite different than what we would normally think of. It's not something that he was told directly by God. God is mentioned nowhere in the text. He does meet with angels, but he never talks directly with God, which also sets him apart from all of the others. Now, when they began to look at this, also in Megillah, they also talk about the fact if all the people in the world were put on one side of the scale and Daniel was put on the other side, Daniel would have greater weight than the entire world. Now, you have to understand that would be including the Abrahams, the Isaacs, the Jacobs, all of the great ones, the Moseses, all of the rest. But his intellect was far superior to any of that. And we give Solomon the credit for being the smartest man. But evidently, Daniel had something that the rest of them didn't have. And so that's why we're going to talk about Daniel quite differently. Now, tonight, I want to spend my night really giving you background. And the reason we need to get background is because his stories are going to be based upon things he has seen, things he has read, and things that he's in the midst of. So like you and I, we study the Torah. Like you and I, we live in a world, we hear things, we read things, and we begin to assemble those things into our mind, and we begin to create understanding. Well, the understanding of Daniel is going to be far superior to anything that we can do. In fact, there's no way I can completely give you all the understandings in the book. What I will tell you is I will go to several sources. One of the sources that I'm going to use is called the Sefer Yetzirah. The Sefer Yetzirah is basically the oral stories of Abraham. everything that Abraham understood. Now remember, Abraham was a prophet because he did speak directly with God. But Abraham was different from all of the rest of the characters. And so as he's beginning to put his book together, and it wasn't a book, it was just oral stories that were passed down. It wasn't until centuries later that it began to be collated and put into a book. The second books that I'm going to talk about is called the Zohar. Now, there's going to be places in the Zohar that I'm going to quote in these 12 weeks, 13 weeks that we're going to go through this. And so you're going to hear some things that were written in the 2nd and 3rd century by characters. Actually, it was Moses de Leon who actually created the books, which we call the Zohar. And the Zohar is not complete. There's a Zohar Takune. There are lots of other small additions, but it gives you some understanding the fact that this is all wrapped up in the mind of Daniel. The third thing I'm going to quote to you from is what we call the Talmud. We're going to learn about some of the Gemara, some of the stories and the writings, and then we're going to do some rehashing over those stories. So all of those things are going to be put in there. There's other books that I've got, the Bahir, which was another old prophetic book that was written centuries before, back in the days of probably Hezekiah. So we're going to go through a lot of different kinds of things. And so I want you to kind of get ready for understanding that this whole thing is going to be tied together by our experiences, because I'm going to ask you to think about some of these things, and can some of this roll into our minds? Now, some of what I've talked about, I learned when I was in church, when I was a Christian. I've since modified much of it, but I at least still have that basic understanding in my mind. And so that's where I begin, because that's where most people will start from a Christian background. And so that's important that you understand. I also want you to understand that when Daniel did his writing, Daniel was basically, when he first arrived in Babylon's court, was about 15 years old. He arrives there along with the other three, while at the same time, other characters of the scriptures arrive. Before we started, Ross and I were talking about another character that arrived. He went down to the river Kavar, which is called the river already. So in other words, he's down further away. Actually, he's in the area of the Chaldeans. And we're going to talk about the Chaldeans, and we'll look at Psalms 137, because that's important to understand what's going on. There's also the understanding that Mordecai, we know Mordecai with Esther, he will be taken into captivity in this first round. In fact, there were 10,000 people that went into captivity at this particular point, and we'll go through understanding, because you see the nation of Judah, not Israel, but Judah, because Israel's already gone. They went almost 100 years earlier. They fell apart, and Sennacherib, who was an Assyrian, basically captured all of their land and came very close to capturing Jerusalem. If it wasn't from a miracle from God, Judah would have gone at the same time, but they were spared, partially because of the king who was on the throne was named Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, as we know, was a righteous man. His one flaw was the fact that he chose not to get married, because he understood that if he did, his child would become very evil. And so he chose not to get married, but he almost died because of making that choice. And so he changed his mind, and he did marry. The interesting thing is he married an older woman. It was Isaiah's daughter that he married in an attempt to create a righteous son. Didn't happen. He created what we call Manasseh, who was probably one of the most evil kings, who ruled for 55 years and basically destroyed Israel and destroyed Judah as a spiritual nation. Now, as we go through our stories, then we're going to be talking about the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are important to our story. And the reason the Chaldeans are important to our story is because the Chaldeans are really the strong arm of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was considered a Babylonian. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar his mother was Chaldean, his father was Babylonian. And so he came from both cultures. But a Chaldean was a very, very savage group of people, but they were also very, very intelligent. They are the ones that created what we would think of as astrology. They're the ones that would come up with the study of the bones of a dead man. All kinds of things that we read in Deuteronomy were evil. That is part of their culture. That is part of where they're coming from. And so as we're looking at our story, we're going to see something rather unusual. Right now, I'm going to jump out of order, and I want you to turn in your Bibles to a prophetic book called Habakkuk. Now, it's not called Habakkuk in Christianity, it's called Habakkuk. But his real name is Habakkuk, because the B is actually a V sound. And it's a schwa, or a short U sound. So we're going to look at Habakkuk for a little bit. Habakkuk was what we would call a watchman on the wall. His whole being, his whole presence was about looking out over the area. He's found in the book right behind Nahum. I don't know if you even know where Nahum is, and right before the Zechariah. Or Zephaniah. So hopefully you can find it. If you had an art scroll, you're looking at page 1391 in an art scroll. So whatever Bible you're using is fine. This is the one that I've got, so that's how I'm going by it. But I want you to look at this story, because Habakkuk has been watching on the wall, but he's also a prophet. And in his time that he's on the wall, and if you look at verse number 2 and 3, let's go there first. We begin by saying, well, first off, might as well do one. The prophecy of Habakkuk, the prophet saw. So this is what he's seeing. And so in other words, it's the visions. How long, O Hashem, will I cry out and you will not hear me? How long will I cry out to you regarding injustice and you not save? Why do you allow me to see iniquity and to look at the evil deeds with robbery and injustice before me, while the one who carries strife and contention still remains? Understand, this is who he's talking about, but he doesn't give a name right away. It's understood who he's talking about, but you don't understand it unless you go further into the text. And so I want you to go down a little bit further, and I want you to look at verse 5. It says, look among the nations and observe and be utterly astounded, for God is bringing about an occurrence in your days that you will not believe when it is arrived. For behold, I am establishing the Chaldeans. Now he gives us an understanding of who he's talking about, but look at how he's framed it already. Understand? So we're looking at Babylonians and Chaldeans, but Habakkuk notices and wants us to understand that the real problem is going to come from the Chaldeans. And we'll get into understanding that when we do Psalm 137. So that bitter and impetuous nation that will go across the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not their own. It is awesome and terrifying. It is judgment, and its burden goes forth from it. Its horses were swifter than leopards, and it's fiercer than wolves of the evening. And the horsemen are fleet, and its horsemen will come from afar, and they will fly like an eagle hastening to eat. What he's describing is what you and I would think of as the Blitzkrieg. And if you remember the World War II stories of the Blitzkrieg, you knew how evil the SS were, because the SS were a part of the German army, and that's exactly what the Chaldeans are, the SS of the Babylonian army. The Babylonian army wasn't just composed of Babylonians. It was a set of groups that were together, including the Assyrians at that point in time, and the Arameans. Lots of groups. The Hittites also belonged to this group. But he specifically finds the Chaldeans, that's the one he wants to talk to. If you go further down, you'll look at verse number 12. Are you not from the beginning of time, O Hashem, my God, my Holy One? Let us not die. What is he expecting to happen at this point in time? He's expecting annihilation, because that is what they did. They annihilated their enemies, and they killed women, children. Nothing stood in their way. And the more they got caught blood, the more fierce they were and the more problems they caused. Now, notice he goes on to say, O Hashem, you have ordained him for judgment. O strong, you have established him to chasten us. Now, he's established judgment. Chaldeans will be judged. But God is using the Chaldeans to judge Israel, or in this case, Judah, at this particular point in time. So we're looking at a group of men that are very, very fierce, that are very, very warlike, that are going to cause no end of trouble for the Jewish people. And Habakkuk only prays that we can survive this. Now, put that in your mind of how we're living today. With all of the troubles across the world, we begin to wonder what's going on. Well, imagine a prophet hearing these words or saying these words, because he knows what's coming. He didn't get a newspaper article that told him about the Chaldeans. Word of mouth from nations, traveling groups that came through Israel, all of those would have expressed the same feelings, the same ideas. So this is part of what's going on. And I want you to put in your mind, some of Daniel's thinking comes from these stories, comes from the prophets themselves. That is where he's beginning to build his understandings from. He's going to build understandings from things like Joseph and his ability to tell dreams, because he will use the same strategies that Joseph uses to establish the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar. Later, he's going to create his own dreams based on things that he has understood or things that has bothered him. And he's creating for himself these word pictures in which he will find himself in the middle of them, or standing by the river, or looking above the river. All of these things are going to be added into our stories, and they're all going to help us understand who he is. But remember, Torah is basic. Now, not only is Torah basic, but remember Abraham. Do you remember where Abraham came from? Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham came out of the Chaldean culture. Coming out of the Chaldean culture, he was indoctrinated in all of the superstitions and all of the astrology and all of the sciences that they had. That's where Abraham came from. Now we have a 15-year-old who has studied Torah for the first 15 years of his life, is now going back into that culture. And now he's being taught all of the same things that Abraham was taught. Imagine how much he now knows, how much he is learning. How many stories has he created in his mind based upon what he's learned in the last few years? Knowing what's going on in the world. Now remember, he is part of a group of 10,000. 10,000 were part of the first exile, and he was a part of that. Now our story deals with Daniel, and for a little bit we're going to deal with the three boys. But the stories are about the nations. Do you understand? It's about the nations. So we're really going to be talking about the world in general. This is a Gentile book. This is where we go to find out what we think is going to happen. It's not all in here, because Daniel will not tell us everything. He will only give us certain specific information. In fact, in one chapter, it's chapter number 8. He hears the holy voice. Well, actually, chapter 7. It says that he only tells us part of the story. So he has the dream with the 4 monsters, and yet he'll only tell us part of the story. What is he hidden? Now, if you're going for hidden information, you go to things like the Zohar. you actually go to look at the words themselves. Are there unusual facets of the words? Are the vowels there? What is it that we're going to glean from the right side, or the Hebrew or Aramaic? Because again, the story was written in both Hebrew in the first chapter, Aramaic through the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh chapter will all be in Aramaic. And then chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 will all be in Hebrew. So we're going to get a mix of languages between one and the other. Now, let me try to explain to you why there's this mixture of languages. Well, before I do that, I want you to, again, you've got your Bible open to Daniel. I want to look at the first verses of some of these chapters, okay? So the first chapter I want you to look at is chapter 1, and I want you to look at the beginning of that story in chapter 1. Now I got to go back and find it again. Chapter 1 begins in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Okay? 3rd year reign of Jehoiakim. Chapter 2. Is he continuing the story? No, he's in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Chapter number 7. Let's skip over to 7. Well, we can do 3, I guess. Chapter 3 is just Nebuchadnezzar's story. Chapter 4 is dealing with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Chapter 5 is Belshazzar and his writing on the wall. 6 is Darius the Mede, the king of the Persians, 62 years. But look at chapter 7. Chapter 7 begins in the 1st year of Belshazzar. 1st year of Belshazzar. But we just went through chapter 5, which was the last year of Belshazzar. Can you see we're not talking about chronological order in our stories? This is not about following an order. Look at chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins by the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. So that's closer to the end of his reign. If you look at chapter 10, well, chapter 9 deals with Darius and Ahasuerus. But chapter 10 says in the 3rd year of Cyrus the Persian. Chapter 11 goes back and says we're now in the 1st year of Darius the Mede. Our stories are not consecutive. There's no chronological understanding here. So the question becomes, why isn't it written in chronological order? It's a book, isn't it? And the answer is no, it's not. Originally, it was a set of scrolls. Each of these chapters was its own scroll, according to some. Some say there were only 6 scrolls and they just stitched them together and they put them in this particular order. Then I asked the question, well, who put them in this order? And the answer is the Great Assembly. When they discussed whether Daniel belonged in the scriptures or not, they also determined how it was going to fit into the scriptures, where things were actually going to be in the scriptures. And so they began to look at it. And as they're looking at the scriptures, one of the things that they begin to notice is just this fact that they're scrolls. And so they begin to put the scrolls together. I want you to understand that the first 6 chapters were not written by Daniel. They're all written in the 3rd person. In other words, somebody else has actually written them and they have attached them here. So in other words, these are historical accounts that he's talking about. It's not till chapter 7 that we actually go to 1st person. From 7 on is in 1st person, meaning that Daniel is doing the talking. So you have part of your Bible or part of your book is not written by Daniel. It's written by others who are telling Daniel's story in order to help us understand Daniel. Now, I also want you to understand that if you had a Catholic Bible, you would have 15 chapters in the book of Daniel and not 12. Because you see, the chapters that are going to be missing are in what we would call in the Catholic Bible the Apocrypha. These are the ones that were non-canonized. Some say it was because they came too late. They found their script too late. Others say that they did not qualify. They did not meet the standards. Well, if you're looking at that, I want you to understand, let me tell you about the 3 books that are missing, or the 3 chapters that are missing, help you understand a little bit. The first chapter that's missing is actually one that would probably go as Daniel chapter 13, and that's the story of what we call Susanna. Susanna was a righteous woman who was the wife of a priest. Well, 2 of the elder men in the community attempted to create some sexual relations with her, and she denied it. And so they took her before the committee, telling them that she had committed adultery, not with them, but with someone else. And so the whole story of chapter 13 is this understanding that she was an adulteress. It was Daniel, according to this story, that'll actually come and prove through a dream that what she was not telling a lie, but was that these 2 men who were said to be righteous, and Daniel's word was far greater than these 2 men, and so they ended up dying. The second book that comes, their second chapter, actually comes in the middle of Daniel chapter 3, because Daniel chapter 3, remember, talks about the 3 Hebrew children and going into the fiery pit. Well, one of the characters who goes into the fiery pit, whose name was Azariah. Azariah was actually one of the 3 Hebrew boys, and Azariah created what they call the Song of the 3. And so his song is actually, Azariah is Abednego, but beside the point. The understanding is that this song should have been placed into Daniel, but it wasn't. Again, there's this idea that it's not one single scroll, but it's going to be stitched together. That's how it's going to be made. It's not the only book that goes that way. We know Jeremiah has some stitching in it. Some are even thinking that maybe there was some stitching done in the book of Deuteronomy, but there's lots of places where things have been inserted or thought to have been inserted. Now, the third section was actually going to be Daniel chapter 14, and that deals with Bel the dragon, which is an entirely different story. It's about Bel is a god, and supposedly every night they bring food to him, and every morning all the food is gone. And so they were trying to establish that Bel was the greatest of all gods. Well, it's Daniel who said, this was during the days of Darius, Daniel said to them, I don't believe that. Give me the night to prove it. So that night, after they had brought all of the food before Bel, the doors were locked, nobody could get in. And before he completely locked it up, Daniel spread ashes on the floor of the temple. After spreading the ashes on the floor of the temple, the next morning when they unlocked the doors, lo and behold, there's lots of little footprints all over the floor, indicating that somebody had gotten in there. Well, the only ones who could have gotten in there were the priests and their children and their wives, which ends up becoming the story of another Daniel in the lion's den, because that's what happens to all of them after this event. And Bel no longer becomes the chief god of the Persians at that point in time. So these are 3 additional stories that aren't in here. So hopefully what I'm trying to get across to you is that there are certain things that are going to happen, and these things are not necessarily in chronological order. These things are not necessarily written by Daniel, but they all come together as the Jewish understanding, the sages' understanding, as significant events in the lives of Israel and in the safety of Judah. Daniel becomes one of those leaders. He leads from the palace in Babylon. Ezekiel, who also goes in that first wave, will lead from the river Kavar. In the city of Jerusalem, one of the last prophets that will be taken will be Jeremiah. Jeremiah will spend much of that last part of his time in Jerusalem in jail, in a pit, because of the things that he's saying that makes people uncomfortable. Could there possibly be a situation where Jerusalem is destroyed? I don't like that story. Let's get rid of it. So they took Jeremiah, who they knew was a prophet, and they couldn't kill him. So they simply took him off the books. But at the same point in time, if you read the story of Jeremiah, the things that he had written down, chapters 1 through 35, will be burned. And it won't be until after that that he will have his scribe rewrite the first 35 chapters and then go on to finish the next 20 chapters, ending in Jeremiah 52. So these are all of the characters that we're going to be dealing with in our story. Now, historically, I've given you the story of Habakkuk. I've given you a little bit of an understanding of the Chaldeans. I want to finish that understanding by having you look at a book of Psalms. And I want you to go to Psalm 137. Now, 137, again, it's a psalm by David, but it's not David's psalm. It's actually a prophetic psalm, something that's going to happen. And so I want to read this to you, and I want you to understand or to follow along what's going on. Now, it says, by the rivers of Babylon. David never ended up by the rivers of Babylon, so this story is not about David. So by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and also wept when we remembered Zion. So our characters that we're looking at are characters who find themselves exiled. They're now living along the river. The river was actually called Kavar, but people would assume that's really a channel off of either the Tigris or the Euphrates. That's where they believe it happened. This river channel is in the area of Ur, the Chaldean area. So we get another picture of what's going on. So in chapter 137 in Psalms verse 2, it says, on the willows within it, we hung our lyres, or kinnah. We hung our lyres. Who played the lyres? Well, David did, but it was an instrument used by the Levites. Understand, the Levites that were taken captive also, and many of them will end up with Ezekiel down along the river. And so they took their kinnah, their harp, and they hung it in the trees. Well, why did they hang it in the trees? Because they did not want the people, the Chaldeans, to see them, because it was going to cause no end of grief for them. So our captors requested words of song from us with our lyre playing joyous music. Well, the joyous music they were asking for were the psalms themselves that were being sung at the temple. But they knew they weren't going to be able to sing joyous music. How can you sing joyous music when you're in captivity? And not only were they in captivity, but they were also being crushed in the beginning of this captivity. In other words, 10,000 were taken out, but not all 10,000 are going to survive. When the Nebuchadnezzar's men march these 10,000 back to Babylon, it was a forced march. Now, if you ever remember the stories of Bataan, you know that the Japanese force marched the American soldiers great distances with very little rations, very little food, and no rest. That's exactly how the Israelites moved to Babylon. They were force marched to go. So some of them will die along the way. Others will die because of a sport that the Chaldeans used to enjoy. Let's pick on the exiles. According to some of the writings in Josephus, piles of Judeans were laying along the beach, along the river itself. piles of them. Understand then that this is not exactly the easiest time. Now, Jeremiah will tell us later, and we'll read about it later. Excuse me. Jeremiah will tell us later that they should get used to their captors because they're going to spend 70 years there. And I want you to thrive. But when you first go, thriving is not what you're thinking about. Thriving is what you had. Now they're thinking about something different. And so they're being forced to play these lyres. Well, guess what? They weren't interested in playing the lyres. In fact, according to stories, they broke their fingers so they wouldn't have to play. Well, what did that do? The Chaldeans began to pile more bodies, not just of the players, but their families. And so we begin to watch an atrocious set of circumstances going on. Now, it goes on to say in verse number 4, how can we sing a song of Hashem upon the alien soil? That's the last that they said. How can we do this? Then another voice, and I want you to understand, this is another voice. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue adhere to my palate. If I fail to recall you, if I fail to elevate Jerusalem above my foremost joy. Who said that? According to the scholars, that was God. God was talking back to them, encouraging them during a time when you probably were not looking to be encouraged. You found yourself in a situation that was far worse than anything that you could have imagined. And so that was going on. So now as we're going through all of this, we're now beginning to see things that are happening. It all really began with the death of Hezekiah. With his passing, the last of the righteous kings, less Josiah, actually occurred. And they began to move downhill, which is what we fear is going on in the United States today. Half the country thinks that we aren't worthy, that we're slave owners or whatever have you. Well, that same mindset was going through the people of Jerusalem and Israel. But the problem was, it was all tied to idolatry, that which God could not stand. Manasseh came in after Hezekiah, and what did he do? He built altars on all the high places. He began to change the worship in the temple. He inserted his own altar, made it larger than the altar that was already there. And on that altar, he slaughtered his animals. Things were not going well. And what was happening was the entire nation was becoming corrupt. Imagine 55 years of corruption. What would it look like? That's the story that we're talking about. Daniel has not been born yet. You see, after Manasseh, we have his son, Ammon. Ammon lasts only 2 years, and then he will pass on. But he does worse, according to the book of Kings. He is worse than his father. Now, his father had 55 years to do bad. He only has 2 years to be worse than his father. From here on, we begin to see a slow erosion, although it's not so slow because Josiah walks in. But Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king, and he will die 11 years later. So he's 19 or 20, I think, is my understanding from some of the readings. Some say he's older than that. But in his reign, he began to change the things. He changed the hillsides. He eliminated all of the idolatrous worship up on the altars. He eliminated the second altar in the temple. He did many, many righteous things. In fact, remember, he's the one that found, or he didn't find, but he was a part of the understanding of a book that was found in the temple that he made to be read to all the people. And that book was supposedly the book of Deuteronomy that they would go through each and every year. Well, actually not each and every year. They would go through in the years of the leap month. After Josiah dies in battle, Jehoaz, his son, becomes king. His reign is 3 months. The Egyptian king, Necho, decides that he doesn't like him. So he takes him out, kills him, and replaces him with his brother, Elichem. So Elichem becomes the next king, and he's under the control of the Egyptians. Well, the war is going on between Egypt and Babylon, back and forth. Jerusalem and that area is the battlegrounds over and over again. Eventually, Necho loses, Nebuchadnezzar's team wins. And actually, it isn't Nebuchadnezzar, it's Nebuchadnezzar, his father. And at that point in time, Elichem is eliminated. In his place comes Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim, he is one who lasts very little time, but in the time that he's there, he had struck deals back and forth trying to extend his life, but it doesn't work. And that's when we begin to see the first of the exiles. From there, we go to Zedekiah. Zedekiah will be the last king. He will be the king that tries to sneak out of the palace when the enemy army has now breached the wall. He'll be caught, his whole family, those that are with him. He will stand there while the Chaldeans will disembowel all of his family. After that happens, they put his eyes out and he walks back to Babylon where he dies in captivity. So this is the situation that they find themselves in. Daniel, during the 3 years that's going to be happening in this first chapter, which we'll get into next week. During those 3 years, he is being trained in all the Chaldean arts. He is learning what Abraham learned a long time ago, but he also has the Torah, and he also has the sharpest mind. He doesn't hear from God. Certainly he'll hear from angels, or he'll talk with angels, but that is not because the angels or because God himself has made the angels aware of him. They've come to talk to him. So it's going to be rather a strange look. So we're going to go through 12 chapters. The 12 chapters are not in order. They came as strips that were stitched together. And so that's the order in which we're going to be reading them, is the order that they come. But they're definitely not in sequence. There's no chronology to this. And the first 6 chapters are written in the third person. So I want you to help understand who Daniel is, the situation in which he finds himself, and the nations around, how his life has been shaped, just like your life has been shaped in the situations that you find yourself. That's going to be a part of the story. That's also going to be a part of how he interprets his story. Interpretation is always based upon things we know or we can resolve to understand. That's where Daniel comes in. That's how Daniel works. But understand, by the sages of Israel, he was said to be the greatest. He would be able to stand on one side of a scale while the world was on the other side. So imagine the intelligence that this young man has. And he's going to live not only through all the Babylonian times, which bothers him because he comes to the end of the 70 years and he says, oh my gosh, does that mean Israel is lost? God has divorced us? What are we going to do? What are we going to think? And then he will continue on through Darius the Mede, past Cyrus the Persian, all the way into the days of Esther and Mordecai and Ahasuerus and Haman. And that will be where he comes to an end. According to the most scholars, his tomb is most likely in this outside the city of Susa, which was the capital city during the days of Esther and Mordecai. So that's where he will end his life. That's as far as I really want to go tonight. I just want to give you the background for what we're about to study. I've been talking for 46 minutes, so it's not like this has been a short discussion, but I want you to understand that. And to help you, if you have questions now, I'd like to talk to you about them. If you've got something you'd like to say, to add, whatever have you, I'm glad to talk to you. So is anything anybody want to share or add to the story so far? Oh, Mary, I'm sorry, I didn't see the hand.
I was just wondering, do we know how old he was, Daniel was when he died?
No, no, that information, well, no more than we know how old he was when he came into Babylon. We think he was 15. That's the best guess that they have. They know he's gone through the law because he wants to practice kashrut, but they're not certain of anything beyond that. And so as we begin to go through this, he could be close to 100 years old by the time this is all said and done, because he goes through 58 years of Babylon. He doesn't, or 52 years of Babylon. He does not go through the entire 70. And we'll talk about that when we get into the book of Jeremiah and add the 70 years, because the 70 years are not clearly stated. We have to go to two sets of scriptures in Jeremiah to figure out. But he will be in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. That will be when he goes into captivity, exile. So he'll spend the next years in Babylon. Then he will leave Babylon at whatever age, 60. He will go through Darius, then he'll go through Cyrus the Persian, then he goes into Ahasuerus. So we know he's got a long life, but we're not sure how long it was. In fact, his life was cut short because Haman had him killed. So anyway, that's all we know for sure.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Ross, you got something to add?
Well, a minor detail. In and amongst all that this is going on, the temple artifacts are taken out and brought to Babylon also.
Yeah. And not only the temple artifacts, and I thank you for mentioning that. Not only the artifacts, but the gold that the temple has stored will be saved. And the reason I mention that is because when we get into the story of the statue is far too tall for its width and is unable to stand. It keeps getting blown over in the wind. Nebuchadnezzar will take all the gold that he has taken from the temple and build a platform so that he can stand his statue of gold on top of it. So imagine how much gold Nebuchadnezzar has taken. Now, Nebuchadnezzar knew that there was a lot of gold there. If you go back to Book of Kings and you go back to Hezekiah invited the Babylonians into the temple area where they began to see all the things that were there. He invited him into a palace where he saw all the things that were there. So when it comes time for them to pick and choose what they want to take with them besides the 10,000, there goes the gold and some of the utensils. All of that will end up going. So it's a rather interesting story. But the base of the statue in chapter, what is it, chapter 4? That base of that statue was made from all the gold that came out of the temple that had been collected over the years. It's quite a story. Thank you for reminding me of that. Anything else? Wow. I hope you stick with me and you get to understanding all of Daniel. For some of you, I send you my copies. If you're interested, I'll send you the things that I have. Next week, I want to go through chapter 1 and give you some. I may review some of this that I've talked about this week in order to reinforce what we're going to learn in chapter 1. But again, Daniel didn't write chapter 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. They were written by somebody else. So, shalom, everyone. Lila Tov. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Steve. Great intro.
Thanks.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom,
Shalom.
shalom.